In Desert and Wilderness, Henryk Sienkiewicz. Chapter 2. Meanwhile, a piece of good news awaited them at home during dinner. A few weeks earlier, Messrs. Tarkowski and Rawlinson had been invited, as expert engineers, to inspect and assess the works on the whole network of canals in the El-Faiyum province, near the town of Medinet, close to Lake Karun and along the Joseph River and the Nile. They were to stay there about a month and had obtained leaves from their company. Since Christmas was approaching and neither man wanted to be separated from the children, they decided that Staś and Nel would also go to Medinet. On hearing this, the children almost jumped out of their skins with joy. Up to that time, they had known the towns along the canal, namely Ismailia and Suez, and beyond the canal Alexandria and Cairo, under which they had seen the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx. But those had been short trips. A journey to Medinet-el-Faiyum required a whole day's travel by train south along the Nile, and then west from El-Wasta toward the Libyan desert. Staś knew Medinet from tales told by younger engineers and travelers who went there to hunt all kinds of waterfowl, as well as desert wolves and hyenas. He knew it was a separate, large oasis on the left bank of the Nile, yet independent of its floods and with its own water system formed by Lake Karun, the Bahr Joseph, and a network of small canals. Those who had seen the oasis said that although the region belonged to Egypt, separated from it by desert, it formed a distinct whole. Only the Joseph River seemed to bind that area to the Nile Valley by a thin blue thread. Great abundance of water, fertile soil, and splendid vegetation made it seem like an earthly paradise, while the extensive ruins of Crocodilopolis attracted hundreds of curious travelers. For Staś, however, the shores of Lake Karun, alive with birds, and excursions to the desert hills of Gubail el-Sedmont to hunt wolves were the main lure. But his holidays would not begin for a few days. Since the canal inspection was urgent, and the senior gentleman could not afford delay, they arranged to leave at once, while the children with Mrs. Olivier would follow a week later. Both Nel and Staś wanted to go immediately, but Staś did not dare ask. They began to ask questions about the journey, and rejoiced afresh when told they would not stay in the uncomfortable Greek-run hotels, but in tents provided by Cook's travel company. That was the usual arrangement for travelers going from Cairo for an extended stay in Medinet. Cook supplied tents, servants, cooks, food supplies, horses, donkeys, camels and guides, so the traveler need think of nothing. It was an expensive way to travel, but Messrs. Tarkowski and Rawlinson had no need to count the cost. All expenses were borne by the Egyptian government, which had invited them as experts to inspect and review the canal works. Nel, who loved camel riding above all else, received her father's promise of a separate, humpy mount on which, together with Mrs. Olivier or Dinah, and sometimes with Staś, she would take part in excursions to the nearby desert and to Karun. Mr. Tarkowski promised Staś he would allow him to go hunting wolves by night, and that if he brought home a good school report he would receive a true English rifle and all necessary hunting gear. Confident of his marks, Staś at once imagined himself the owner of the rifle and promised himself many astonishing and epoch-making feats with it. Such projects and conversations made the children's dinner a happy one. Mrs. Olivier showed the least enthusiasm for the planned trip. She did not wish to leave the comfort of her Port Said villa and feared living several weeks in a tent, and especially camel excursions. She had tried camel riding several times, as Europeans in Egypt often do out of curiosity, and the attempts had always turned out badly. Once a camel rose too early before she had sat properly, and she slid off his back onto the ground. Another time an ungainly dromedary jostled her so violently that she could not recover for 2 days. Whereas Nel, after 2 or 3 rides allowed by Mr. Rawlinson, declared there was nothing more delightful in the world, Mrs. Olivier was left with unpleasant memories. She said it might be fine for Arabs, or for a little lightweight like Nell who trembled no more than a fly perched on the camel's hump, but not for serious, somewhat heavy people prone to intolerable seasickness. Yet she had other worries about Medinet-el-Faiyum. In Port Said, as in Alexandria, Cairo and all Egypt, talk turned on little else but the Mahdi's uprising and the dervishes' cruelties. Not knowing exactly where Medinet lay, Mrs. Olivier fretted whether it would be too near the Mahdists, and at last began to question Mr. Rawlinson about it. He only smiled and said, "The Mahdi is besieging Khartoum now, where General Gordon defends himself. Do you know how far Medinet is from Khartoum?" "I have no idea," she answered. "About as far as from here to Sicily," explained Mr. Tarkovsky. "Roughly," confirmed Stas. "Khartoum is where the White and Blue Nile meet. A vast distance of Egypt and all Nubia separates us from it." He wanted to add that even if Medinet were closer to the lands occupied by the uprising, he would be there with his gun. But remembering he had already been scolded by his father for similar boasting, he fell silent. The older men began to talk about the Mahdi and the revolt, the most important question concerning Egypt at that time. Reports from Khartoum were bad. Wild hordes had besieged the city for 1.5 months. The Egyptian and English governments acted slowly. Relief forces had barely set out, and many feared that despite Gordon's fame, courage and talent, the city might fall to the barbarians. Mr. Tarkovsky even suspected that England secretly wished the Mahdi to take the Sudan from Egypt, so that later England could take it from the Mahdi and make the vast land in English possession. He did not share this suspicion with Mr. Rawlinson, not wishing to offend his patriotic feelings. Toward the end of the meal, Stas began to ask why the Egyptian government had taken all the land south of Nubia, Kordofan, Darfur and the Sudan as far as the Albert Nyanza, and deprived their inhabitants of freedom. Mr. Rawlinson resolved to explain. It was because everything the Egyptian government did at England's behest. England having extended a protectorate over Egypt and effectively ruling it as she wished. The Egyptian government did not take freedom from them, he said, but rather restored it to hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. In Kordofan, Darfur and the Sudan there were no independent states recently. Here and there some petty ruler laid claim to lands and seized them by force against the will of the people. Mostly, however, these regions were inhabited by semi-independent Arab-African peoples, with both races in their veins. These peoples lived in perpetual war. They raided each other, seizing horses, camels, cattle and above all slaves, committing many cruelties. Worst were the merchants hunting ivory and slaves. They formed a class of their own, chiefs and rich merchants who made armed expeditions deep into Africa to seize ivory and thousands of people, men, women and children. They destroyed villages, devastated fields, shed blood and killed all resistors without pity. The southern districts of the Sudan, Darfur and Kordofan, and the lands along the upper Nile up to the lakes were almost depopulated in some areas. Arab bands pushed farther and farther until much of Central Africa became a land of tears and blood. England, which you know pursues slave traders worldwide, agreed that the Egyptian government should occupy Kordofan, Darfur and the Sudan. The only way to force those plunderers to abandon the abominable trade and to keep them in check. The miserable Africans breathed easier. Raids and robberies subsided, and people began to live under some law. But the traders disliked this, and when Muhammad Ahmad, called the Mahdi, began to preach holy war under the pretext that true Islam was failing in Egypt, they all took up arms. Thus this terrible war broke out, and up to now it has gone very badly for the Egyptians. The Mahdi has beaten government troops in every battle and taken Kordofan, Darfur and the Sudan. His hordes now besiege Khartoum and push north to Nubia's borders. Could they reach Egypt? Asked Stas. No, answered Mr. Rawlinson. The Mahdi may proclaim he will conquer the world, that he is a wild man who understands nothing. He will never take Egypt, for England would not allow it. But if the Egyptian troops were utterly destroyed, persisted Stas, then the English troops would intervene, troops that have never been defeated, Mr. Rawlinson replied. Why then did England allow the Mahdi to seize so many lands? Stas asked. How do you know she allowed it? Mr. Rawlinson countered. England never hurries, for she is eternal. Their conversation was interrupted by the black servant, who announced Fatma's Manoah had come and begged to be heard. Women in the East concern themselves almost exclusively with domestic affairs and seldom leave their harems. Only the poor go to markets or work in fields like the fellow women, although they too veil their faces. In the Sudan, from which Fatma came, this custom was less observed, and although she had previously visited Mr. Rawlinson's office, her coming, especially at such an hour and to a private house, caused some surprise. We shall learn something new about Smain, said Mr. Tarkovsky. Yes, replied Mr. Rawlinson, signaling the servant to admit her. A tall young Sudanese woman entered, her face uncovered, very dark-skinned, with wild, somewhat menacing, beautiful eyes. She fell at once to the floor. When Mr. Rawlinson bade her rise, she rose but remained on her knees. Sidi, she said, may Allah bless you, your offspring, your house and your flocks. What do you ask? The engineer asked. Mercy, rescue and help in distress, sir. I am imprisoned in Port Said and doom hangs over me and my children. You say you are imprisoned, yet you could come here. And at night too, said Mr. Rawlinson, shrugging. They escorted me here with Zabti, who day and night guard my house, and I know they have orders to cut off our heads soon. Speak like a sensible woman, answered Mr. Rawlinson, moved. You are not in Sudan but in Egypt, where no one is killed without trial. Be certain no hair will fall from the heads of you or your children. But she began to beg him to intercede once again with the government, to obtain permission for her to depart to Smain. Great Englishmen like you, sir, she said, can do anything. The government in Cairo thinks Smain betrayed, but it is not true. Yesterday, Arab merchants came to me from Suakin, who formerly bought gum and ivory in the Sudan, and told me Smain lies sick in El-Fasher, and calls me and the children to him to bless them. All that is your invention, Fatma, interrupted Mr. Rawlinson. Yet she swore by Allah she spoke the truth and declared that if Smain recovered he would surely ransom all the Christian captives. If he died, she, as a relative of the dervish leader, would easily gain access to him and obtain whatever she wished. She begged only to be allowed to go, her heart aching for her husband. What fault had she done to the government and Khedive? Was it her fault? And can she be punished for being a kinswoman of the dervish Muhammad Ahmed? Fatma did not dare call her kinsman the Mahdi before the English for that name. Redeemer of the world. The Egyptian government considered a rebel and impostor. Still, striking her forehead and calling heaven to witness her innocence and misery, she began to cry and wail as Eastern women do at the loss of husbands or sons. Then she flung herself again with her face to the carpeted floor and waited in silence. Nell, who had grown a little sleepy toward the meal's end, woke completely, and with a kind heart took her father's hand, kissing it repeatedly while pleading for Fatma. Please let Daddy help her, she begged. Fatma, understanding some English, answered amid her sobs without raising her face from the carpet. May Allah bless you, little blossom, delight of Umayyah, spotless star. Though Stas harbored deep hatred toward the Mahdists, he was moved by Fatma's pleading and pain. Moreover, Nell interceded for her, And Stas always wanted what Nel wanted. So after a moment he spoke half to himself but loud enough for all to hear. If I were the government, I'd let Fatma go. But since you are not the government, replied Mr. Tarkovsky, you do better not to meddle in matters that are not yours. Mr. Rawlinson, too, felt pity and understood Fatma's plight. Yet certain details in her story seemed pure lies. Dealing almost daily with the chamber in Ismailia, he knew no recent shipments of gum or ivory had passed through the canal. That trade had nearly ceased. Arab merchants could not return from El-Fasher in the Sudan, because the Mahdists at first did not admit traders, and plundered those they could catch. It also seemed almost certain Smain's illness was a fabrication. But because Nel's eyes kept pleading with him, and he did not wish to sadden the girl, Mr. Rawlinson said after a moment to Fatma, Fatma, I have already written to the government at your request, but without success. Now listen. Tomorrow this engineer you see here and I are leaving for Medinet-el-Faiyum. We shall stop for a day in Cairo, because the Khedive wishes to speak to us about the Bad Joseph canals and give us instructions. During that audience I will try to present your case and obtain the Khedive's favor for you. But I can do no more and make no promises. Fatma rose and, stretching out both hands in thanksgiving, cried, Then I am saved. No, Fatma, Mr. Rawlinson answered. Do not speak of being saved. I have told you death does not threaten you or your children. Whether the Khedive will permit your departure I cannot guarantee. The Smain is not ill but a traitor who, having taken government money, does not intend to ransom the captives from Mohammed Ahmed. Smain is innocent, sir, and lies in El-Fasher. Fatma repeated, And even if he betrayed the government, I swear before you, my benefactor, that if they let me go, I will beseech Mohammed Ahmed until I procure your captive's release. Very well. I promise again I will intercede for you before the Khedive. Fatma bowed low. Thanks, Sidi. You are not only powerful but just. Now I beg you also to let me serve you as a slave. No one in Egypt can be a slave, Mr. Rawlinson replied with a smile. I have enough servants, and besides, as I told you, we all leave for Medinet and may remain until Ramadan. I know, sir, for the guard Chadiji told me, she said. And hearing this I came not only to beg your help, but to tell you that 2 men of my Danglekin, Idris and Geber, are camel drivers in Medinet, and will prostrate themselves before you when you arrive, offering their camels and service at your command. All right, replied the director. But that is Cook's company's affair, not mine. Fatma kissed the hands of both engineers and the children, blessing little Nell in particular, and went out. The 2 gentlemen were silent for a moment. Then Mr. Rawlinson said, Poor woman, but she lies as only Easterners can lie. And even in her expressions of gratitude there is some false note. Undoubtedly, replied Mr. Tarkovsky. Yet whether Smain betrayed or not, the government has no right to detain her in Egypt, for she cannot be held responsible for her husband. The government now forbids any Sudanese to travel to Suakin or Nubia without special permission. So this prohibition does not touch Fatma alone. Many Sudanese are in Egypt seeking work, and among them are several from the Dangle clan, from which the Mahdi came. For example, besides Fatma, Chadiji and those 2 Medinet camel drivers belong to it. The Mahdists call the Egyptians Turks and wage war against them, but among the local Arabs are many Mahdi sympathizers who would gladly join him. You must count among them fanatics, former partisans of Arabi Pasha, and many of the poorest classes. They resent the government's yielding to English influence and claim religion suffers. Heaven knows how many have escaped across the desert by passing the sea route to Suakin. So the government, learning Fatma planned to flee, ordered her watched. Only her and her children, as kin to the Mahdi himself, might be exchangeable for captives. Do the lower classes in Egypt truly favor the Mahdi? Asked Stas. The Mahdi has supporters even in the army, which may explain its poor performance, Mr. Rollison answered. But how can Sudanese escape across the desert? It is thousands of miles. Stas exclaimed. Yet, it was by that route slaves were brought to Egypt, replied Mr. Rawlinson. I think Fatma's children could not endure such a journey. She intends to shorten it and go by sea to Suakin, Fatma had said. In any case, the poor woman. Their talk ended there. 12 hours later, the poor woman, having carefully shut herself in at the house with the caretaker Chadiji's son, whispered to him with a frown and a dark look in her beautiful eyes. Chamasi, son of Chadiji, here is the money. Go to Medinet today and give Idris the paper which the pious dervish Belay wrote to him at my request. The children of those Mehendis are good, but if I cannot get permission to leave, there is no other way. I know you will not betray me. Remember that you and your father also come from the Dangle clan from which the great Mahdi was born. End of chapter 2.